Retrospectives might be the most consistently underused tool in agile software development. They happen on almost every team that calls itself agile. They run at the end of almost every sprint. And on most teams, they produce almost no lasting change. The ritual happens. People show up, they write things on sticky notes or a shared board, someone takes notes, the meeting ends, and then the next sprint begins with the same problems that were discussed in the retro. If this sounds familiar, you are not alone. The majority of retrospectives fail not because the people in them are not smart or do not care, but because the meetings are structured in a way that makes meaningful improvement almost impossible to achieve. The standard format, what went well, what did not go well, what will we do differently, sounds reasonable. But in practice it generates lists of observations rather than commitments to change. And a list of observations that no one is accountable for acting on is not a retrospective. It is a venting session. As a QA engineer or QA lead, the retrospective is one of your most important forums. Many of the systemic quality problems that QA deals with, daily unclear requirements, insufficient testing time, late discovery of defects, inadequate communication between dev and QA, are precisely the kind of issues that a well-run retrospective can surface, analyze, and actually fix. In this episode, we are going to cover what makes a retrospective effective, a specific format that works reliably for QA-focused improvements, and the practices that separate retros that produce lasting change from ones that produce nothing. Let us start with the two most common failure modes in retrospectives, because understanding why they fail is essential to understanding what to do differently. The first and most pervasive failure mode is identifying problems without committing to specific, measurable actions. This is the sticky note problem. The team generates a list of observations. We need better communication between dev and QA. Testing time is always too short. Requirements are often unclear when development starts. The team nods in agreement because these observations are accurate and everyone knows it. Someone writes them down. And then nothing changes, because nobody is specific about what better communication actually looks like, who is responsible for doing something different, or how the team will know if anything has improved. The antidote is simple but requires discipline. Every retrospective action item must have a specific behavior, a clear owner, and a measurable outcome or check-in date. Now we need better communication, but starting next sprint, QA will join the developer kickoff conversation for each new story before implementation begins, owned by the QA lead, and we will check in on this in the next retro. That is an action item. The second failure mode is the absence of psychological safety. If people on the team do not genuinely feel safe raising uncomfortable truths without fear of blame, judgment, or political consequence, the conversation will stay at the surface. People will name the safe, obvious problems and avoid the ones that actually matter most. Building psychological safety is a long-term investment, but it starts with how the facilitator responds to the first difficult truth that someone raises in the room. Here is a concrete retrospective structure designed specifically for QA-focused continuous improvement. In the week before the retrospective, the QA lead or engineer prepares a brief quality data summary. This takes 15 to 20 minutes and covers 4 things: the number and severity breakdown of bugs found during testing, the number of bugs that escaped to production during the sprint, the percentage of planned test cases that were executed, and a map of which areas of the application had the most defect concentration. This data changes the character of the retrospective conversation fundamentally. Instead of working from memory and anecdote, the team is working from shared facts. During the meeting itself, run a 4-part structure with time limits. Spend 15 minutes on what worked well. Be specific here, name real behaviors and decisions that contributed to positive outcomes, and celebrate genuinely rather than going through the motions. Spend 15 minutes on what did not work, using the quality data to anchor the conversation in facts rather than feelings. Spend 10 minutes on root cause analysis for the 1 or 2 most important problems, not just what happened but why it happened. And spend the final 10 minutes drafting specific action items, committing to no more than 3, with owners and check-in dates assigned before everyone leaves the meeting. That 50-minute structure is tight enough to stay focused and specific enough to produce outputs that are actually actionable. Let me walk through a detailed real-world example of how this plays out when it works. A development team is 3 sprints into a new release cycle, and their quality data shows a consistent pattern. The user notification system keeps generating a disproportionate number of defects sprint after sprint. In a typical retrospective, someone notes this pattern, someone else agrees it is a problem, and the resulting action item is something like we should improve test coverage for notifications. That item disappears into the backlog and nothing changes. In a well-facilitated retrospective, the observation opens a root cause conversation. The facilitator asks, why does the notification system keep generating bugs sprint after sprint? The team surfaces several contributing factors. The notification logic is highly coupled to 3 other subsystems, which means that changes anywhere in those systems can have unexpected effects on notifications. The acceptance criteria for stories that involve notification behavior are often written in a way that does not specify the expected notification output explicitly, leaving testing to interpret what correct behavior should be. And there is no dedicated regression test suite for the notification system, so every sprint starts from scratch when testing notification adjacent changes. Now you have 3 distinct root causes instead of one vague surface complaint. The action items that flow from this analysis are specific and addressable. First, QA to build a dedicated regression suite for the notification system, owned by a specific team member, to be completed by the end of the following sprint. Second, product to include explicit notification behavior specifications in the acceptance criteria for all notification adjacent stories going forward, owned by the product manager, starting immediately. Third, engineering to schedule a tech debt review of the notification architecture, owned by the tech lead, to be scheduled within the next 2 sprints. 3 specific actions, 3 clear owners, 3 check-in dates. That is how a retrospective produces change. The practice that most dramatically increases the long-term effectiveness of retrospectives is one that almost no team does consistently: the retrospective. At the start of every new retrospective, before you dive into the current sprint, spend 5 to 8 minutes reviewing the action items from the previous retro. Were they completed? If yes, celebrate it and note what the effect was. If not, what got in the way? Does the action item still make sense, or does it need to be revised to be more realistic? This brief check-in accomplishes something that no other practice can: it creates accountability without blame. The question is not did you complete your action item, which feels like an accusation, but what happened with this item and what do we need to adjust? Over time, this follow-up practice signals to the entire team that the retrospective is a real mechanism for improvement, not just a ritual that the Agile process requires. Teams that consistently follow up on retro action items show measurable improvement over time. Their defect rates go down. Their processes get more efficient. Their communication gets clearer. And crucially, the retrospective itself becomes something people value rather than something they tolerate. When team members see that the things they raise in retrospectives actually get addressed and actually lead to better conditions for their work, they invest more seriously in the process. Your takeaway from this episode is a habit, not just a concept. The next time you are in a retrospective, pay active attention to whether the action items being written down are specific and owned, or vague in general. If you hear a proposed action item that sounds like we should communicate better or we need to be more careful about testing edge cases, push for specificity. Ask, what would that look like as a concrete behavior change? Who specifically is committing to doing something differently? How will we know in 2 weeks whether this is working? That one habit, pushing for specificity in action items, will improve the quality of your team's retrospectives immediately and measurably. Subscribe to QA Career Lab for new episodes every day covering practical skills for QA professionals at every level. Next, we are covering how to build a quality culture on your team, because process and tooling only take you so far. What determines long-term quality outcomes is how your team collectively thinks about and values quality.